The sun beat down on the dusty plains of Dry Hollow, a place where the wind carried secrets and desperation clung to every fence post. Clara Mayfield stood in front of the grand office of Baron Silas Creed, her hat in hand and her pride hanging by a thread. Her boots were worn, her dress faded, but her spine was straight and her eyes were clear. She had come to beg not for mercy, but for time. Time to save the only thing her family had left their failing ranch. The Mayfields had once owned good land, but a drought 2 years back had stolen their crops and sickness had taken her mother, leaving Clara to care for her younger brothers and a father too sick to work. Inside the Baron's office, the air smelled of cigar smoke and polished wood. Silas Creed leaned back in a chair that cost more than Clara's entire farm and watched her like a hawk sizing up prey. His suit was black, his boots shined, and his silver watch gleamed like a symbol of power. He had built his empire by crushing those weaker than him, and he had no intention of stopping for a girl with calloused hands and stubborn eyes. He listened to her words, her plea for just a few more weeks to pay off the debt, and then he laughed low and cruel. "You poor folks always think you deserve grace," he said, flicking ash from his cigar. "You want me to wait while your cows starve and your roof caves in. You think I'm running a charity farm, girl." Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't flinch. She met his eyes and said firmly, "We're close. We've got some wheat coming in and my brother found work. We just need until harvest." Creed's lips curled into something between amusement and malice. "Harvest, you say?" He leaned forward, tapping the ashtray thoughtfully. "What? If we make a deal, something entertaining, something everyone in town can watch." Clara didn't like the sound of it, but she nodded slowly. "Going out back is a stallion meaner than the devil himself. Creed said I bought him from a showman who swore he'd seen this horse kill a man. He's untrainable, untouchable, damn near a ghost in black. Hide like coal and eyes like fire. He's been thrown from every pen and bitten every hand. You train him by harvest and the ranch is yours. You fail, and you come work in my kitchens until your bones crack. That's the deal." Clara froze. The room seemed to go quiet, but outside voices were gathering. Ranch hands, townsfolk, a few curious onlookers had followed her into town and now stood near the porch. Some chuckled, others looked at her with pity. One old man muttered she'd be dead in a week if she tries it. She swallowed hard. Her father had told her to stay away from that horse. Midnight was his name, and he was more legend than animal. But legends didn't scare Clara. Hunger did. Hopelessness did. The thought of watching her family's land handed over to a man like Creed made her blood boil. "Fine," she said, finally reaching out her hand to seal it. "You've got a deal." Creed laughed again, but this time there was a glint in his eye that was more curious than mocking. He shook her hand hard like he wanted to break her fingers and said, "Then I suggest you get started. That horse doesn't like to wait, and neither do I." As Clara stepped out of the office into the sunlight, the crowd parted. Whispers followed her like dust on the wind, people asking if she was mad, brave, or both. The stallion Midnight stood behind the barn, watching from the shadows, a creature of power and fury. He reared up once, his black mane flashing and his hooves striking air. Clara looked at him and didn't blink. She would train the beast not because she wanted the Baron's ranch, but because she needed to prove something to herself, to the town, and maybe to the stallion too. She had never been given anything in her life, and she wasn't going to start now with charity from a man who sneered while others suffered. No, she would earn it with grit and guts, and if that meant facing down the devil in horseflesh, so be it. The challenge had been thrown, and she had caught it with both hands. Her future now rested on the back of a wild stallion, and clock was already ticking. Clara stood at the edge of the corral just after dawn, her hands wrapped around the worn rope that hung loosely at her side. Dust swirled in the golden morning light as the ranch slowly stirred to life, but her eyes were fixed on the dark figure pacing within the wooden enclosure. Midnight was larger than she imagined, a towering beast with rippling black muscle and fire in his eyes. He moved with the restless energy of a creature born to run, not to be caged. Each step he took was laced With tension, his ears flicking at every sound, his body poised to strike or flee, the ranch hands watched from a distance, leaning on fences and smirking among themselves. No one believed she had a chance. They had all tried to get close to the stallion, and many had walked away bloodied. One man had nearly lost an eye, another had his ribs cracked. Midnight was a living legend, a beast no rope could hold, no saddle could tame. His file said he'd been beaten, starved, even drugged to try and break his spirit, but nothing had worked. Instead, it had made him more dangerous, more unpredictable. Clara didn't see a monster, though. She saw pain and fear and anger wrapped in the skin of a wild animal. She didn't bring a whip or a bridle or spurs. She brought patience. She sat by the fence each morning and just watched him, studying the way his ears flicked before he bolted, the way he calmed slightly when no one looked at him directly. She spoke softly to him about nothing and everything, her voice carrying across the space like wind through trees. She told him about her family, about the way her father used to ride before he got sick, about the creek that ran behind their house, and the way her mother's bread used to smell at harvest. Days passed with no progress. Some ranch hands laughed, others grew bored and stopped watching. Baron Creed didn't even bother to check in. He was certain of her failure. Clara didn't care. Her world had narrowed to the corral, the sand fence, and the beast on the other side. She brought apples and left them near the water trough. Sometimes they disappeared, sometimes they didn't. But every day she sat, every day she waited. Then one morning everything changed. Midnight didn't run. When she approached the fence, he stood at the far end, his ears perked forward, watching her. She moved slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. She knelt in the sand and turned her back to him, exposing her vulnerability. It was a risk, a gamble, that he wouldn't charge, but he didn't. She heard his hooves in the dirt, slow, cautious steps. He came halfway, then stopped, but that was enough. For the first time, she felt hope, real and solid, like a stone in her chest. From that moment, the bond began to grow, fragile and invisible, but stronger each day. She didn't try to touch him, not yet. Instead, she mirrored his movements, stepping when he stepped, stopping when he stopped. Over time, he allowed her closer. He took an apple from her palm, then another. He flinched less when she spoke, and one afternoon he even let her brush her fingers along his shoulder. His skin twitched under her touch, but he didn't bolt. Clara spent every hour she could with him, studying horse behavior, reading old books borrowed from the town library, and asking questions to anyone who'd ever trained an animal. She wasn't just learning. Midnight, she was learning herself, what it meant to be calm in the face of fear, steady in the presence of power. But progress was slow, too slow. The clock was ticking and harvest was coming. Clara felt the pressure building in her chest like storm clouds on the horizon. Still, she refused to rush. Every time she looked into Midnight's eyes, she saw something wild and wounded, and she knew that trust could not be forced. It had to be earned. Then one evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Midnight came to her on his own, his muzzle nudging her arm. As she stood by the fence, she turned slowly, met his gaze, and smiled without speaking. She reached up, and for the first time he didn't pull away. Her fingers ran along his mane, and he let out a low breath, not a snort, not a protest, but something soft, something close to peace. That night Clara didn't sleep. She lay awake thinking about what she had to do, what came next. This wasn't just about taming a horse anymore. This was about redemption for him, for her, for everyone who'd been told they weren't enough. She had seen the fire in his eyes, and now she had touched the flame. The real work was just beginning, and failure was no longer an option. Clara woke before the sun each morning, her muscles aching from the long hours and her hands raw from rope and reins, but she refused to slow down. Midnight was no longer the demon the town had whispered about. He still flinched at sudden movements and bristled at loud sounds, but he no longer saw Clara as a threat. Their bond had deepened, and each day brought a new step forward. She could lead him by rope now, brush his coat without fear, and even slip a blanket over his back without protest. Yet for all the progress in the corral, the world outside it was growing darker by the day. Baron Creed had stopped laughing. He watched from the porch now, silent and brooding, a cigar smoldering in one hand as Clara worked with Midnight. His eyes no longer held amusement, they held calculation. He had underestimated her, and he knew it. Something about the way she moved with the stallion unsettled him, like she was unearthing a truth he'd buried long ago. He began to interfere. At first it was small things, missing tools, spoiled feed, a delay in hay delivery, but soon it escalated. One morning, Clara arrived to find Midnight's pen gate wide open and fresh cuts along his flank. He'd been spooked, possibly lashed. She stayed with him all night, whispering calm into his ear while he shivered with mistrust. When Clara confronted the ranch hands, they just shrugged. One muttered that the Baron had paid off worse men to do his bidding. Another said she should have never taken the deal to begin with, that she was only making things worse for herself. But Clara wasn't afraid of the Baron, not anymore. She had faced worse things than him: hunger, loss, the slow death of hope. She would not back down. Then came Isaiah. He arrived at the ranch one morning with a bag over his shoulder and a letter from Creed that no one read aloud. Tall and quiet, with eyes that mirrored the storm-gray skies of fall, Isaiah introduced himself as a new hand. Most didn't question it, but Clara noticed the way the Baron looked at him, tense, guarded, resentful. Later, she overheard whispers in the bunkhouse. Isaiah Creed, the Baron's estranged son. The one who ran off years ago and hadn't been seen since. The boy who once loved horses more than money and who'd sworn he'd never set foot on his father's land again. Clara didn't know why he'd come back, but she didn't trust it. Not at first. But Isaiah didn't speak much. He just worked. Quiet, steady, watching from afar as Clara trained the stallion. One evening, after everyone else had gone, she found him leaning on the corral fence, his arms folded, his eyes on Midnight. "You're doing it wrong," he said without looking at her. "You're working with fear in your shoulders," Clara bristled. "I've gotten this far without your help." "You've gotten far," he agreed, "but not far enough." She turned to leave, but then he added, "He doesn't just need to trust you. He needs to feel free." "You're still holding something back," that stopped her. Because he was right. Over the next few days, Isaiah showed up more and more, offering advice she didn't ask for but couldn't ignore. He taught her how to read Midnight's posture more carefully, how to use the rhythm of her breathing to calm the horse, how to let go without losing control. He didn't push her, didn't try to take over, he simply stood beside her and offered what he knew. Slowly, Clara began to see Isaiah differently, not as the Baron's son, but as a man torn between two worlds. He hated his father as much as she did, maybe more. And she began to realize that he carried his own wounds, deep and hidden, just like Midnight, but the Baron noticed their growing connection. And he didn't like it. Soon the sabotage grew bolder. Clara found Midnight's water poisoned with something bitter. A nail was driven through the saddle she'd left hanging in the tack room. One afternoon, someone tried to spook the stallion while she was working with him, causing him to buck wildly and nearly trample her. Isaiah tackled the ranch hand responsible, fists flying until blood hit the dirt. The hand was fired, but not by Creed, by Isaiah. In front of everyone. It was then Clara realized the Baron wasn't just trying to stop her, he was trying to break her spirit. But what he didn't understand was that she'd already been broken once, and rebuilt stronger. With enemies all around her and trust still fragile, Clara pressed on. Midnight depended on her. And now, for reasons she wasn't ready to admit, so did Isaiah. The air had grown colder as the days marched toward harvest. Leaves fell like forgotten promises, and a restless tension hung over the ranch. Clara could feel it in the way the ranch hands went quiet when she passed, in the silence that followed Isaiah wherever he walked, and in the look Baron Creed gave her from his porch tight-lipped, cold, and unreadable. Midnight had come far in the past weeks. He now let her ride bareback within the corral, responding to the lightest touch of her heel or whisper of her voice. He was no longer the wild thing of legend, but a proud, intelligent animal with a soul one she had slowly earned piece by piece. But the closer Clara came to victory, the more dangerous things became. One afternoon, as she led Midnight from the barn, a sharp crack of gunfire rang out from the tree line. Midnight bolted, eyes wide with panic. Clara was thrown into the dirt, and before she could rise, the stallion was gone, disappearing into the hills beyond the ranch. Clara's breath caught as dread filled her chest. He was gone. All her progress, all her time, vanished with the thundering of hooves. She searched the hills until nightfall, calling his name, her throat raw and her hands scraped bloody from the rocks. At dawn, Isaiah found her in the canyon just outside the property. Midnight's tracks led to a narrow pass where the stallion had become trapped on a ledge, too afraid to move forward or back. Clara didn't wait. She climbed down slowly, talking to him all the while, her hands steady, her voice low. He trembled as she approached, his flanks slick with sweat and fear. She moved closer, inch by inch, until her hand touched his cheek. He let out a shaky breath and leaned into her touch. Clara slipped a rope gently around his neck and guided him back to safety. Not with force, not with fear, with trust. By the time they returned to the ranch, Midnight was calm. Clara was exhausted, but a fire burned in her chest. He had chosen her. He had trusted her when it mattered most. And now she was ready. Word of the escape and the recovery spread fast. Whispers turned to murmurs. Some of the ranch hands began treating her with quiet respect. Others stayed silent, waiting to see what Baron Creed would do next. And it didn't take long. That evening, Clara was summoned to the main house. Creed sat in his leather chair, drink in hand, watching the fire. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said without looking at her. "You think one ride will change the world." Clara didn't respond. She'd learned by now that silence unnerved him more than any insult. He turned to face her. "The deal was harvest. That's 3 days away. But I'm done waiting. You ride him tomorrow. In front of everyone. No tricks, no rehearsals. Saddle up, show the town. Or the deal's void." Clara nodded once. "Fine. Tomorrow." But she didn't leave. Something had shifted. She looked around the room, the trophies on the wall, the oil paintings, the framed deed to her family's land on his desk. And she asked the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Why that horse? Why me?" Creed's eyes narrowed. "Because no one breaks him. Not even you. And because your family has always been too proud. Time someone taught you your place." That night, Isaiah came to her quietly, his face pale, eyes burning with something she hadn't seen before grief. "There's something you need to know," he said. "About Midnight." He told her the truth. The stallion once belonged to his mother, a kind, fearless woman who had loved animals more than gold. Creed had bought the horse for her when they were newly married, but after she tried to leave him, something happened. The story was never clear, but Isaiah remembered the shouting, the gunshot, and the silence that followed. Midnight had gone wild after that, and Creed had tried to have him put down. Instead, the stallion escaped and vanished for years before being caught and sold. Creed bought him back not to save him, but to finish what he started. Clara stood in silence, her heart pounding. This wasn't just about a wager anymore. This was about justice, for the horse, for Isaiah, and for everyone the Baron had crushed under his boot. The next day, as the townspeople gathered and whispers filled the air, Clara walked toward the corral in silence, saddle in hand. She wasn't afraid. Midnight met her at the gate, calm, steady, waiting. She mounted him with ease, and the crowd fell into stunned silence. Tomorrow she would ride him before them all. But today, in this quiet moment, Clara knew the truth. She had already won. The morning of the ride arrived with a heavy sky. Clouds gathered low over the plains, casting the ranch in a gray stillness that felt more like a battlefield than a pasture. Word had spread like wildfire Mayfield would ride the wild stallion at noon, and Baron Silas Creed was making sure the whole town was there to witness it. This wasn't just a test anymore, it was a show, a public spectacle. And for the Baron, it was a last attempt to humiliate the poor farmer's daughter who had dared to defy him. The corral was transformed. Rough benches had been dragged in from the church, barrels flipped over for makeshift seats. Dozens of townsfolk had gathered, ranchers, merchants, farmhands, even the schoolteacher. They lined the fence, whispering with anticipation. Some came out of respect for Clara's courage. Others came to see her fail. And Baron Creed sat at the center, his boots kicked up, a cigar clamped between his teeth, his smile tight and cruel. Clara stood by the stable, one hand resting gently on Midnight's shoulder. He was calm, almost unnaturally so, his dark eyes locked on hers as if he knew what this meant. Her heart beat loud in her chest, but her hands didn't tremble. She had spent weeks training for this ride. More than that, she had earned it. Not just through skill, but through trust. She had given Midnight something no one else ever had, a choice. Isaiah came to her side, holding the saddle. He didn't speak for a moment, just looked at her. There was pride in his eyes, but fear too. Not fear of the horse, but of what would come after. "I don't think it's just a ride he's afraid of," he said quietly, glancing toward the Baron. "He knows what it means if you succeed. You take the ranch and everything else he controls starts to crumble." Clara nodded. "Then let it crumble." With Isaiah's help, she saddled Midnight slowly and carefully. The stallion didn't flinch. She placed one hand on the pommel, took a breath, and mounted in a single smooth motion. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The Baron narrowed his eyes. She rode him into the center of the corral, sitting tall and still. Midnight's ears flicked back once, then forward again. He was ready. The Baron stood. "Let's see it then," he barked, voice sharp. "You've got 5 minutes, girl." "Prove yourself or get off my land." Clara gave no answer. She nudged Midnight forward, and the stallion began to move out with the wild, unpredictable chaos the crowd expected, but with purpose. Smooth and strong, he trotted the perimeter of the corral, responding to the faintest pull of the reins. She shifted her weight, and he turned, slowed, then broke into a canter. The crowd fell silent. Clara guided Midnight through a series of turns and stops, then dropped the reins entirely. She extended her arms and leaned forward, whispering to him. The stallion picked up speed, galloping now, his mane streaming like a black banner, his hooves striking thunder into the dirt, and she never lost control. People rose from their seats. Children cheered. Someone yelled her name. Baron Creed stood frozen, his face drained of color. This wasn't a stunt. This wasn't a lucky ride. This was mastery. Clara slowed Midnight, brought him to a clean stop, and dismounted in one fluid motion. She turned to the Baron and said loud enough for all to hear, "The deal was made. The stallion is trained. The ranch is mine." The Baron stepped forward, face twisted with rage. "You think this changes anything?" He spat. "You think I'll hand over my land to some dirt-born girl because she sat on a horse?" But before Clara could speak, Isaiah stepped forward, holding a small folded document, the original agreement. It was signed, witnessed by 2 ranch hands, and legally binding. Isaiah had made sure of it. "You will," Isaiah said, "or the sheriff gets this and the entire county hears what you did to my mother." A hush swept through the crowd. The Baron's jaw clenched. He looked at Isaiah, then at the horse, then at Clara, and knew he had lost. He ripped the deed from his coat, tossed it at her feet, and stormed off without another word. Clara didn't pick it up. She looked at Midnight, who stood calmly beside her, ears forward, muscles relaxed. The crowd slowly dispersed, some shaking her hand, others simply nodding in quiet awe. She had done more than tame a stallion. She had broken a cycle. She had defied a legacy of cruelty and proved that strength comes from trust, not power. Isaiah stayed behind. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They both knew this wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of something better. The next morning, the ranch felt different. The wind was the same. The dust still clung to boots and window panes, and the fences creaked with every passing breeze, but the weight that had hung over the land for years was gone. For the first time in recent memory, the place breathed. Baron Silas Creed had left without a word, his carriage rolling away before sunrise. He didn't say goodbye to anyone, not even Isaiah. No one watched him go, and no one tried to stop him. He vanished like a shadow chased off by the sun, leaving behind nothing but his name and the damage he'd done. Clara stood on the porch of the ranch house, her house now watching the land stretch out around her. In her hands was the deed, signed and sealed, no longer a dream but a truth. She didn't smile. Not yet. There was too much to do. The victory was real, but it wasn't the end. It was just the foundation. The first thing she did was visit her father. He was sitting in a chair on their old porch, a blanket around his shoulders, the boys playing nearby. Clara handed him the deed with quiet hands. His weathered eyes scanned the paper, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, with tears silently sliding down his face, he reached for her hand. "You did it," he whispered. "You saved it." "No," she said softly. "We saved it." Back at the ranch, the changes began quickly. Clara reopened the barn and cleared the old paddocks. She hired back a few good ranch hands who had been fired by Creed for speaking out. She paid fair wages and gave the workers proper rooms instead of the old drafty bunkhouse. The fences were repaired, the pastures were cleared, and the barn was painted for the first time in years. But the biggest change was for the animals. Clara took in mistreated horses from nearby farms, offering a place for the broken and unwanted animals like Midnight, who had been thrown aside because no one took the time to understand them. She brought in a veterinarian from town to help tend to the wounded ones. Soon, the ranch had a reputation, not just as a place of business, but as a sanctuary. Midnight remained by her side, no longer feared, no longer wild, but still untamed in spirit. He ran the fields freely, but always returned to her call. He had become more than a horse. He was the symbol of what could be saved, what could be healed, and what could rise from ruin. And Isaiah stayed too. At first he helped fix up the stables, repaired the windmill, brought her supplies. But over time, their work became more than just shared labor. They talked about their mothers, about the years they lost, about the people they used to be and the ones they wanted to become. There was something quiet and steady between them, not rushed, not dramatic, but real. Isaiah never tried to take credit for what she'd done. He simply stood beside her, offering what he could when he could. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat on the hill overlooking the ranch. Midnight grazed nearby, the sky painted in orange and rose. "I don't think he ever loved anything," Isaiah said after a while, speaking of his father. "Not really." Clara looked at him. "You're not him," he nodded. "I know. But I spent years wondering if I was." "You're not," she repeated, firmer this time. "You're someone who came back. That matters." He looked at her then not like someone waiting for permission, but like someone seeing clearly for the first time. "I think I'd like to stay. Help run things. If you'll have me." Clara didn't answer right away. She just smiled, small and genuine. "We've got a lot of fences to mend. and some good land left to sow. That was enough. The town began to change too. People started treating Clara differently, not as a girl from a poor family, but as someone who had done what no one else could. She didn't crave admiration, but she earned respect. And the story of the girl who tamed the wild stallion and took back a ranch from a rich baron became more than a rumor, it became legend. But Clara didn't live for the legend. She lived for the quiet mornings and the sound of hooves in the field, for the letters from nearby farmers asking if they could bring in a horse to be healed, for the evenings when Isaiah played his mother's old guitar on the porch, and for the feeling that, at long last, she had not just won land, but built a life that was truly hers. And every evening, when the wind cooled and the sky dimmed, midnight would gallop across the open fields, free, fast, and wild. Just like her,